Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back at the Pavilion for New Ideas. This is the third day of the fifth European Forum for New Ideas, now 2015. Well, we had breakfast debates, round tables, plenary session, and now we are going to begin another plenary session, then 2 rounds of panel sessions, and at the evening we are going to have a gala, closing gala. During the gala event, we will summarize our debates and share with you the Sopot declaration. Let me extend a cordial welcome to the representatives of the business community, politics, media, non-governmental organizations and international organizations. I'm very excited that this is yet another occasion that we may inspire each other and share views and make new contacts. After this session, we are going to have a lunch break, which will be served at the Sheraton Hotel, and that will be an excellent networking opportunity. And now a short housekeeping remark. There is a phone, a black phone that was found, so was lost and found, and it is deposited at the reception at this pavilion. So if someone is missing his or her phone, and if this phone happens to be black, this person may call on the reception desk at Sheraton Hotel to collect the lost phone. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin the second plenary session of today, How to Fix Capitalism. This session will be moderated by Michał Broniatowski, the editor-in-chief of the Forbes magazine. Before I turn the floor to Mr. Broniatowski, I would like to ask you to take out your smartphones and tablets and to log into the EFNI application, because we are going to ask questions during this session, and on top of it, we will ask you to vote. And Mr. Broniatowski has the first question right away. Yes, before I ask the panelists to join me on the stage, I would like to raise a provocative question. The organizers of our meeting decided to come up with something that you may call a paradox, namely, we are going to have a discussion about things that go wrong with capitalism, and therefore they invited the editor-in-chief of Forbes, the magazine that praises capitalism, to moderate the discussion. Therefore, I decided to start the session with a provocative question. Do we really need to fix capitalism? Perhaps capitalism is okay, is in good shape. We will not have the question on the screen, but you may open up your apps, go to the vote, and select the title of this session, How to Fix Capitalism, and you may say yes or no. Okay, we've got a question, and we've got the results, but there is a few more minutes to cast your votes. Yes, please take time to vote, and now I will invite our guests. Mrs. Maria Morris, Executive Vice President of MetLife Corporation. She's responsible for employee benefits programs. And let me just remind you that MetLife is the key and main partner of this discussion. Now, Mr. Peter Ohser, who's the Executive Vice President of MoneyGram. MoneyGram is the company that handles global money transfers. And this is another representative of the business community on this panel. But we will have other sectors represented as well. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Ondřej Liška, who represents Ashoka Association. This is the association that brings together leaders of change and change agents, people who are engaged in the social aspects of capitalism. And I believe that he will have a lot to say on that matter. And Mr. Thomas Pogge from Global Justice Program. Okay, we have some technical problems, but we will fix it. So I understand that now I may be seated as well. Yes, these are the results of the vote. I am very happy that you agree with me that we need to fix capitalism, because if you said that it was not needed, basically we could go home. But apparently we do have something to talk about. So now when I got seated, my first question goes to Mrs. Maria Morris of MetLife. How we should refresh capitalism, and who's going to do it, the governments or the companies?
First of all, I just want to say thank you for having me and MetLife as the sponsor of this great event. And I also want to thank Luitan and Nika and others for really having this very important conversation about the future. As I think about MetLife, MetLife is a world-leading life insurance and employee benefits company covering over 100 million people across 50 markets. And we invest over $500 billion US in the markets around the world. So we think about this question a lot in terms of what should we be doing about capitalism. From our perspective, capitalism has worked. You can look at many studies, including McKinsey, who says that over the last 50 years, we've had a situation where the economy has grown sixfold, where GDP per capita is up 3 times, and where hundreds of millions of people have actually escaped poverty. So we have a good history of what capitalism has done to date. But we have to look into the future. And we all know that growth has slowed down in many markets and is drying up in traditional sources of growth. And so the future is uncertain unless we step back and think about how to refresh capitalism. So the question of whose role is it? I think it's really everyone's role. There's a role for government, and there's a role for private corporations, of which I'm representing. And we can look at a number of different things, whether it's investment in infrastructure, whether it's technology and digitization, innovation through small, medium enterprises, through different types of corporate abilities to innovate, whether it's labor reform. But what I'd like to concentrate on today, given that we deal with multinational and local corporations around the world, is what the role of private businesses, what's their role, and how can we all take the opportunity to do something now? So when I think about that, I think about increasing productivity at our workplaces. And if you think about the labor shortages, 40% of Polish employers told us in an independent study last year that they will have a talent shortage in the next 12 months. And that's very similar to the manpower studies across the globe. So how do we do more with the workforce we have? One of the biggest global trends that we are seeing is that private industry is starting to focus on the health and well-being of their employee population. They're doing that to attract and retain employees and to make them more engaged and productive. And it makes sense. If you think about the fact that across the globe, governments are not in a position to cover the same level of retirement and healthcare needs through their social programs that they've done historically, there is a role for businesses through their employee benefits programs, through financial education, through corporate responsibility, to be in a position to actually invest in helping employees get the financial health they need, take the stress off of their financial issues, to also invest in the wellness, health and wellness of their population. And what we find, and we have studies that prove this, is that when employees are more engaged, they're more productive. And when they believe that the employer is investing in them through wellness programs, through employee benefits, through their corporate cultures, for every 1 point that they're happier with the corporation in these places, they're 12% more engaged. So there's many things we have to do across the globe to really refresh capitalism. But one of the things we need to do is ensure that we are taking action now to make our workforces more productive. And so by investing in programs like health, wellness, financial education, we're in a position as private businesses to start to deal with the productivity issues that can help us move forward and refresh capitalism for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We decided that before we start discussion between our panelists, each of them... Przyzwyczaiłem się do tego angielskiego.
Okay, I got used to English, but well, my point is that each of our panelists will have the opportunity to have a short intervention, and that will be followed with a discussion. So now I would like to turn to Mr. Ondřej Liška of Ashoka, who mentioned to me prior to the session that capitalism may turn out to be the greatest challenge to the middle class. And theoretically speaking, the middle class should benefit most from capitalism. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I think I was very happy to hear such a radical question, actually, which you don't usually hear in conferences. So for me, being here is somehow connecting two roles that I have played in my previous life. After 13 years being engaged in the Czech politics on a national and European level, I quit politics after 13 years and joined an organization called Ashoka that is focusing on supporting social entrepreneurs in the world. Just to connect what you said, I think the answer to your poll behind us, should capitalism be fixed, is definitely yes, because the answer to the question, does capitalism work for everybody, is no. And let me just begin with the middle class. Maybe just to illustrate with a simple fact, in some 1982 in the UK, there were only 7 financial executives in the country who were receiving 6-figure salaries. Now there are nowadays some tens of thousands who are in this position. But if we look at the salaries of teachers, doctors, attorneys, etc., we see actually a no move in some professions, actually a decrease in the real income. I mean, we could illustrate this in many dimensions, but this is just to be clear about how capitalism is being perceived by a large part of the society. Now, what could we do? I think the answer is twofold. There is an entrepreneurial answer to that, and there is a political answer to that. First, capitalism, if we quote or change a little bit the famous quote of Winston Churchill about democracy, that it's not working perfectly, but it's the best thing actually that has been developed by the humankind. I think capitalism is exactly the same case. So dreaming about a totally different system is I think, not in place. So what could we do? I think capitalism has showed in the history that it has an immense power to change reality for the better. How could we use this force now? I think the question that is related to that is, are we using the notion or understanding the notion of ownership in the best terms? How do we actually perceive ownership in our times? I think there is a responsibility connected to ownership. And I think we can see it in many dimensions, on the level of corporations, on the level of small and medium-sized enterprises, but also in terms of citizenship. How do citizens, middle class, perceive ownership of their school, of their neighborhood, of their governments, of their political parties they are members of, etc. So I think we should rethink this dimension as well. What Ashoka does, I'm the country director of Ashoka in the Czech Republic, and what we try to do worldwide is that we select and support social entrepreneurs, people who have a huge entrepreneurial spirit, who are entrepreneurs themselves, but they use the force of entrepreneurship to solve difficult and burning social question of our times. And I think this is something that should be thought of not only by individual entrepreneurs, but companies and corporate world on any level that I have mentioned here. There are many examples of this force being actually used and employed in solving environmental and social issues. So tearing down the walls between the civil and private sector is actually a better cooperation of these two worlds, I think, is one of the solutions for capitalism. And let me end up with the second part of the answer, and I think that you have mentioned actually in the very beginning. It's not only the private sector, but also a very political question. I think those who actually vocalize the threat that people are captivated by of dark future, of seeing banks and actually nation states falling into debt, etc. I think it's the extreme left and right. Both of them are somehow better in formulating and addressing these fears. And what we liberals, if I may call it so, actually don't like to hear. And we are very often not able to address these fears and to give them proper answers. What to do? I think the question of trust has been mentioned here in this forum as well a lot of times. And I think we should not stop by just saying we lack trust in politics between the citizens and those who are actually mandated to solve the social questions, economic questions, environmental questions of our times. But we should also think of practical methods and processes that actually put trust back into the very center of the society. And I think participation is one of the very key points in not only in terms of politics, but also in terms of economy and capitalism. How can we make a larger number of citizens to participate in economy? And I think this is where the civil sector and the private sector should join hands and think of better solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Peter Ohser, MoneyGram. We were talking before the meeting about society of values, which is certainly connected with what Mr. Liška just mentioned in his speech. Also, you were concentrating on a sort of ethics of the capitalists, ethics which should be regulated by, I understood it in such a way, controlled by clients of these capitalists. Is it enough?
So let me just start with, answering my question. I think capitalism is imperfect, but it's not fundamentally broken. And so with that, there are going to be flaws, there's going to be tweaks, but we do believe that today it is the greatest thing that has driven, the economy. I live in Texas. We're kind of the home of capitalism in America, and it's a pro-business type of environment. So you tend to see it and breathe it, but there are challenges with that because there are people that are left behind. And I would go to believe that capitalism is inherently an incentive-based system. People invest capital because they believe they're going to get a return. People drive companies and drive innovation because they think they're going to sell more product and build their business. Employees are incentive-driven. The challenge where capitalism breaks down is when you have ethics problems and when you have moral hazards. And I think the rule from the government and from others in regulation is trying to say, how do you remove those moral hazards to be able to protect, from the bigger disasters? A question that I would have for everyone in the room, I'll take another poll here, an informal one with your hand, but how many of you would not buy a Volkswagen because of the ethical violations of the company? So actually a minority, which says something about how we view these our leaders and our organizations, right? I believe that inherently companies respond to markets. They respond to the market needs. And if the market is asking them to be ethical or I'm not going to buy your product, they will be ethical because we respond to markets. That's what we are. We serve our customers. But if this is truly the case, there won't be any issues to Volkswagen. They'll be back selling cars very quickly, and their stock will continue on. The CEO will see what happens, but he walked away with a giant pay package, and everyone just says, we're done. And I think that's a problem. That's a moral hazard for us as an organization. I do think there needs to be accountability. I work in financial services. I have accountability, and I feel that deeply. As the CEO and chairman of our European entity, if I break the law doing anti-money laundering, I can go to jail. So it supports strong governance inside my organization to be able to make sure that I'm not going to jail. And so that moral hazard is removed for me to be able to, change the rules, if you will. But I do believe that capitalism is a reflection of society. And so to change it, we do need to change the societal views and the values that are there. And I do think that is happening, but it's not happening very quickly. And we certainly see it in the millennials and the younger generation that are coming up that are expecting more of their leaders and are looking for companies that stand for something and are supporting not only their employees, but their customers and others beyond. Because they do look at these companies and looking at the value systems of the company. We are fighting for talent on a global basis. MoneyGram operates in 200 countries. Every day we are trying to find the brightest and smartest people that are value-oriented. We serve the underprivileged. We serve the bottom of the pyramid on a global basis and providing financial inclusion. And we can do that without gouging the customer, by investing in digital, by bringing down the cost and making people's lives better, and we're very proud of what we do. And a lot of people are attached to that. So I do believe you can have a value-driven organization, and I believe that, that increasingly employees are looking for companies like that, and we hope that more come out from that.
Okay. Professor Thomas Pogge, you were mentioning in our conversation before the meeting about global context of problems with capitalism. You pointed to the fact that capitalism problems, if at all problems, are completely different in Brazil, for example, and Norway. You are in Poland now, where we probably have less problems than elsewhere. However, politicians would say different. So what's your view on fixing capitalism, if at all we need it?
Yeah, so there are many different ways of organizing a human society, and some of these are capitalist and others are not. So the important thing here is that capitalism is not one thing, but capitalism is a whole family of different ways of organizing society. They have in common an emphasis on markets and entrepreneurship and private ownership of means of production, but they also differ in many respects. And to see that, as I said earlier, you can just look at countries as diverse as Brazil, China, Germany, Norway, Honduras, Paraguay. These are all capitalist countries in one way or the other, but they differ, of course, quite dramatically, and they also differ in the extent to which we would want to fix them. So Norway needs much less fixing than Brazil or Paraguay for sure. So capitalism at its worst can be quite terrible. You have a system where some people are extremely rich, others are poor, there is no social mobility, the rich hand over their privileges to their children, the poor are in a hopeless position and will remain poor, their children will not be educated, will essentially share the fate of their parents. Capitalism can be horrible, but capitalism can also be wonderful and allow all the members of society to participate in the great productive potential that capitalism can unleash. Now, what we have seen in the last 25 years or so is a new interesting phenomenon. Namely, we have globalization, which means, among many other things, that the structure of human societies is now shifted from the national level to the global level to a large extent. So much of the basic rules that structure and organize human societies are made at the supranational level. They're made in intergovernmental negotiations at the G20, at the WTO, and so on. And these rules increasingly constrain and replace national rules, and they become quite important. This phenomenon, I think, as it has actually played out, has on the whole not been so good, because we have seen dramatic increases in inequality as a result, inequality both within countries and also inequalities among human beings worldwide. So just to give you some figures, the income of the bottom half of the human population has shrunk to about 4%. So the bottom half have 4%, the top half have the other 96%, and just the top 5% of the human population have 43% of global income. With wealth, it's even more dramatic. The bottom half of the human population have 0.6% of wealth, less than 1%. And if you ask yourself, how much do we need? How many people at the top do we need to match the wealth of the bottom half? The answer is 66 people. 66 people at the top have as much wealth as the 3.7 billion people who constitute the bottom half. Now that inequality is bad enough, but it becomes even worse when you think about how poor the poor people in the world really are. We have officially 800 million people undernourished. I can assure you the figure is at least twice as high. This is simply miscounted by the FAO, and I'm willing to go to bat and explain this to you if you want to hear it. We have still enormous poverty, deprivations, people have lack of access to clean water, lack of access to medical care, and so on. And these are hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. We have about a third of all human deaths from poverty-related causes, people dying prematurely of diseases of which nobody dies in Europe, for example, diarrhea, malnutrition, and so forth. So this inequality has consequences, and the consequences are quite horrible. So that's where I think capitalism, the capitalist global structure, needs to be fixed. Now, why do we have this increasing inequality? I think this is not the fault of capitalism, but it's the fault of a specific form of capitalism, the way the details of our particular global capitalist order have been designed. And that order is negotiated among governments in negotiations in the G20, in the WTO, and so on. And these governments are, of course, influenced by their constituents. But those who can really influence the negotiating positions of governments are by and large the big multinationals, the big banks, the big hedge funds, the billionaires, and ordinary people, people like myself and certainly ordinary people in developing countries, they will not know what's going on in these negotiations in Geneva, in New York. And also, even if they know what's going on, they will not be able to influence effectively their government. So the US government will be influenced by the interests of its big corporations and banks, and similarly, the Indian government will be influenced by the interests of its big export companies, its big billionaires. And so when these governments get together and negotiate the rules will tend to reflect the interests of that small elite, people who will try to influence their governments, and the rulemaking will not reflect the interests of the vast majority of the human population. You all know what that is. It's regulatory capture. It's as old as the universe. We have always had regulatory capture, the attempt to influence those in power. But at the global level, which has become so important now, global rulemaking, at that global level, regulatory capture now is reserved to a very small elite of very rich and powerful agents who are able to influence that international rulemaking. There's no democratic counterweight. There's very little transparency because these negotiations happen behind closed doors, and often, except for WikiLeaks, ordinary people like myself cannot even find out what the draft texts are that are being negotiated. And moreover, unlike the national case, there's also at the global level a very easy way to dismiss moral concerns and moral arguments. They get dismissed by people saying, don't you know, international relations are a jungle, and we are competing with the Chinese, we are competing with the Russians, we are competing with the Americans. So because we are competing with these evil, shady creatures, we cannot play moral. We are moral. We would love to be moral, but unfortunately we have to play hardball because we are competing with the Chinese, with the Americans, with the Russians, whoever your favorite boogeyman is. And so morality is left to one side, and these very powerful agents negotiating in behalf of their most powerful constituents, of course then come up with rules that tend to increase the share of the global social product that goes to that small elite that have influence, and as a necessary consequence of that, the share that goes to ordinary people and especially to the poor is constantly shrinking. So inequality is driven through a kind of spiral which works through existing inequalities translating into political inequality, inequality of influence, which then leads to unequal rules, which in turn aggravate the existing inequality. And so what we need to do in order to fix not maybe capitalism, but to fix regulatory capture, is we have to find ways of democratizing the international rule making so that these rules reflect not only the interests of a small elite, but the interests of all human beings on this planet. If we could achieve that, capitalism would work brilliantly. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo za te wstępne.
Thank you very much for your statement. I have to tell you that I'm disappointed. The question was, the question to our panel goes, how can we fix capitalism? While actually we've never identified a disease apart from one given by Professor Pogge, namely that people who have much less money, they are not adequately represented where they should be represented, where the future is being decided. It is something which is a significant problem, but we haven't heard here any notion, nobody mentioned what is something which is touching minds of left-thinking intelligentsia. What Professor Pickett wrote about the imminent state of contemporary capitalism, where one part of people have to be indecently rich, while the other part have to get more poor. My question to panelists is following. The inequality which each of you has mentioned, is it the main problem, the main issue of the contemporary capitalism? Because to me it seems that there are others, like for example employment to everybody who need work, or equal opportunities for men and women, or innovations and following the development. So maybe we will be able now to identify what is the main pain, what is the main threat for the contemporary capitalism. Which one of you would want to comment it?
I believe that it really is the responsibility of our regulators, of private corporations, and of individuals, that capitalism is about incenting all parties to do the right thing. And I think we did hear some arguments that say we all have a role to play. So if we think about consumers as an example, educating consumers more about their voice, which I think we heard from two panelists, and we see them already starting to have a voice where they are in a position to buy from companies that have ethical standards. So the role of government, in my view, there is that the government needs to put accountability standards and really think through governance of corporations so that you can create corporate cultures and really incent senior leaders that have the ethical values that are going to be able to use incentives in capitalism appropriately. So as an example, certainly the company that I work for, 150-year company, we're an insurance company, so we take risk, and we're there to promise to pay when people need it. So it's very important that we have the ethical standards of investing in the communities that we're in, and that includes both our customers as well as the broader communities, getting more people into the financial system, helping people to be able to first get out of poverty, but then be in a position to protect what they have. And so government's role there, I believe, is more accountability, and more governance around how corporations use the incentives of capitalism to be able to deliver not only for their customers, but for their broader communities. I think in terms of consumers, certainly they're starting to purchase from companies that have ethical standards. And you can look at many studies, Edelman being one of them, that just suggests that in 2013, when consumer purchasing was almost flat, that consumers were purchasing in companies that had more ethical products and services. So I think the consumers are starting to have a voice. Not enough of them yet are educated or in a position to know about it. Certainly MoneyGram and others trying to get financial education and financial vehicles into the most poor is really important. But I think the rest of the consumers have a role here. For private corporations, our role is to first have a value structure. And senior leaders, it's a top-down strategy to have a value structure in terms of really using incentives appropriately across delivering for customers, delivering for communities, and delivering in public cases for our shareholders. And that is top-down and values-driven. And so companies really have to invest in their governance structure, their value programs, and really encourage government to not put in incentives or that really incent the wrong behavior, put in regulation that incents the wrong behavior. We may have seen some of that prior to the financial crisis in the financial services industry. And so we really do have to work together to ensure that whatever the regulations look like, they don't incent companies to do the wrong thing. And so we have to build the trust back that we talked about earlier. And as a result of that, we need to think about how we form regulation and how private corporations continue to get incented to have the ethical behavior and actually invest in the communities that they do business in.
Okay.
May I briefly react to your question? I think as we have addressed here inequality as one of the main reasons why to think that capitalism doesn't work for everybody. I think that is clear. I don't regard inequality just in terms of income, but inequality is a much broader term that actually includes participation in democratic politics. It means also access to education, access to public goods, or access to the right to live in a clean environment. I think this all includes the broader notion of inequality. Definitely, ultimately, we need better regulation. I don't think the debate, if regulation yes or not, would bring anything. I think it's the last century. I think we need, again, the debate on how to regulate in a more efficient way to leave enough space for entrepreneurial spirit, but at the same time setting conditions that actually enhance the access to the public goods and quality of life. So this is a big argument for the actually European Union and a pro-European policies, especially here in Central Europe. I think as far as the markets have actually escaped the jurisdiction of national policies and escaped to a global level, I think that is quite clear that the partner for the global markets actually is actually the European Union. I don't think Poland or Czech Republic can actually force or to be a partner for globally operating corporations actually to talk about this. But at the same time, I've spent here like 3 minutes here actually preluding on the need for better democratic policies, but at the same time, I don't think we should expect the solution how to fix capitalism only exclusively from politics. I think the leadership on ethical standards can't be left to politicians. Actually, companies, individuals, parents, you just name it, could become leaders in the society in actually setting new standards. I think there are still places that we have not used or made use enough of the opportunities to set better ethical standards. And I think companies should not only react to markets, of course, that's their principle, but more and more they are becoming leaders in setting ethical standards. I don't think that CSR, the corporate social responsibility as a concept, is enough. We need much more than that. We need companies that actually invest into solutions of social problems, not only react to markets.
To by się zgadzało, tylko że firmy jednak ich głównym celem jest
Well, we know that the companies are profit-driven because of the greed. So the greed is the problem.
Mówimy tutaj i pani Morris i pan Liška.
Both Mrs. Morris and Mr. Liška said that regulations are important, and it's important that companies comply with such regulations, but ethical attitude of companies also matters. Now, the crisis of 2007-2008 was caused by Lehman Brothers and other banks who found a way to go around all the regulations, to ignore them. And during the last month, we had a Volkswagen story. In the US, the regulations are pretty tight. Everything is regulated. Everything should be fine. But it turned out that Volkswagen was cheating on such a scale that they were able to place on the market the equivalent of 2/3 of all the cars that drive on the Polish roads. That was one huge scam. So what can we expect from regulation?
That's a great question, and I think about it as we talk about the moral hazard of ethics, but I think ultimately you do need to hold people accountable, and that is the deterrent, right? If you are the CEO and you walk away with a $30 million package and you're done, it's not really a deterrent for the next person to do it. So I do think that there has to be strong incentives to discourage this type of behavior. And so I do think that that is possible. It is through regulation, and you're seeing more of that across governments. Still today, in 2007, 2008, you haven't seen much blame being passed on some of the bankers. But I think this was not one individual. This was a cultural. This was an entire society that had built up and thought about it. My own company was nearly financially just ruined because of these things, and we had to get capital and all kinds of other things to do it. We were very close to understanding those things, but it's. But there has to be incentives for the management and a culture to be able to say, we're not going to do those things. And if you do those things, there has to be a strong deterrent not to. So I think that governments are starting to do that. Certainly in the US, a lot more of this is coming our way. And so as a director of an organization, you feel very strongly about these, and then it becomes governance through the organization. So I think we're moving there, but that is through strong governance and through regulation.
Professor Pogge, what do you think? What is more regulation imposed by governments, by central governments, central administrations, a solution for unethical corporations?
Well, in theory, yes. In practice, no. And the reason is the regulation has to come from somewhere, right? It's not going to just come from the sky, from the heavens. So regulation emerges in political processes, and so long as these political processes are not clean, you are not going to get the right regulation. It's not so difficult to think up what the right regulation would be, but it's very difficult to get it through the political system. So let me talk a little bit in response to what my colleagues have said. The thing, Volkswagen is not a typical case. Volkswagen did something absolutely stupid, really dumb. The idea that they would not be caught is ridiculous. Of course, they were going to be caught sooner or later. And this breach of regulation is not what companies normally do. What they do is they buy the regulation or they buy the application of the regulation. So the first thing is through lobbying, right? So big corporations have often dozens, if not hundreds, of lobbyists in Washington or other capitals, Brussels, to influence the rulemaking in their own favor. And they also take good care to make sure that those who are charged with applying the rules and regulations are in their side. So, for example, there is the revolving door phenomenon, where people work in the regulatory agency for a while, and then a few years later, they get a very well-paying job in the very companies that they used to regulate. And they know that, they anticipate that, and they know that if they behave nicely as regulators, then they will get a cushy job later in industry. So that's how it's normally done. That's how intelligent companies do it. Now, it's all good and fine. I agree to say companies should be more ethical. But of course, we also know companies are under a lot of competitive pressure. And so long as there are some companies in an industry that are not ethical, it's very difficult for me to say, as a CEO or a high-level officer in my company, to say, well, we'll be ethical even if that means we lose market share to this other company. Right? The other company, let's say, is paying a lot of money to Congress people to influence procurement, and if I don't do that because I think it's unethical, well, then they will get the contract and I will not get the contract. And pretty quickly, the CEO will fire me and put somebody else into my position, or the shareholders will fire the CEO and put somebody in her position, and then again the rut will spread. So that's where I see the fundamental sort of structural problem, and the way in which we can overcome that is through two mechanisms. One mechanism is we have to isolate the political system more from the economic system. We have to try to prevent economic power to be easily translatable into political power. We have to stop the lobbying. And here the US Supreme Court should come in for special blame, because it has repeatedly said that giving money to politicians is freedom of speech. The First Amendment of the US Constitution, which is as sacred as apple pie and mother's milk in America, says Congress shall make no law that abridges freedom of speech. That's great. But then the stupid Supreme Court has said that if you give money to politicians, that is freedom of speech. That's what is protected. That's stupid. And it corrodes and undermines our democracy. So that has to be changed. And it's very difficult to change because the Supreme Court says this is in the Constitution, right? You need a constitutional amendment to change it. The Supreme Court is misinterpreting the Constitution, but there's nothing we can do about it at this point. So insulate politics from economic influence, and secondly, democratize the politics. Make sure that the politics reflects the voices, concerns, and interests of all people, and not just the interests of those who can afford to speak with the loudest voices. If we had that, then the regulation would reflect the interests of all people and would be stably constraining the large enterprises and keep them honest. Ethics alone, I think, will not be able to overcome the competitive pressures. It's, as I said, too hard to be a single ethical company or just one or two, so long as there are others competing with you who are not abiding by the same ethical standards.
Okay. I'd like to respond to that if I could. Good. I think it's I think it is easy. I operate in a global business where there are a lot of bad actors in my business, and we know it, and it doesn't change the way that we do business. And we sit there and we'll talk about it, and we say, why are they able to do the things that they're able to do? But we very fundamentally believe in the rule of law and how we are building our business, because we know that if we break the trust of our customers, we break the trust of regulators or anybody, that is the end of our business. That is our business. We're financial services. We are built on trust. And so, and there are others like it. So I don't think that's a universal truth. And I do think that businesses engaging ethically with lawmakers is an important part of the democratic process. And I do a lot of this, and it is amazing how little lawmakers really understand about the complexities of the issues that they are regulating. And a lot of this is done around and the education, because the people who know these issues are the people that are living this every day. And you can't bring a consultant in because consultants don't really understand my business issues. And done in the correct way, it can be a very productive session, and you can end up with a really good rule that protects everybody. But you have to sit down at the table and understand what they're what their end goal is, and then how you can work on those things. And I think there's a lot of successful cases for that. But there's also cases where I've worked on laws, gotten it through the House of Representatives in the US, and then it's thrown out by the Senate, and they put in some language where no one talked to anyone, and everyone says, what was that? And then even the regulators say, I don't know, that was a bad law, but it's a law, so now we have to regulate you. And so I think the dialogue is critical.
Mr. Liška, you wanted to...
I'm totally subscribed to your analysis of the problem of engaging or actually politics being subjugated to the economic interest. This is truly a problem, but as you've said, do we need a regulation? And you were actually saying, yes, we do. We need to regulate the relations between economic and politics. But again, if I translate your analysis to a political program, how many people you think would vote for you? How do you actually, so the question I think in this panel is, how do we practically go ahead? So the question is, what can we as civil society, entrepreneurs, businesses, investors, etc., politicians do for this? And my answer is, again, we cannot expect that actually the regulation coming from politics will actually set the standards. The regulation will only come about if there is a demand for it. But is there a demand for it? I don't think so. I think it's a very small portion of a society that would actually subscribe to the analysis that we have given in this panel. So where is the leadership on the change that we would like to see? I think it's in self-organization on a variety of levels. It's not only politics, that actually the politicians and regulation actually reacts to facts that are actually on the ground. It doesn't prescribe the future. So if we think of the future, we can't expect it to come from this corner. Therefore, I think we have not been able to use still sufficiently the force, the power that actually lies within the civil society, and economy is actually part of the civil society in broader terms. I mean, political parties, businesses, investments, etc., it's a part of civil society. And I think the leadership on ethical values, it's already coming from the entrepreneurial part. It's not only the corporate social responsibility, but it's actually companies that try already to invest and make the ethical standards as their business model. And I think this is something that has been in the past very much underestimated. And I think that the walls between the civil society and entrepreneurial sector are actually still too high and has not been used actually in terms of for the goal of solving the social problems. So as I said, 13 years in politics, in national and European politics, actually gives me enough experience to say that regulation is very important, but at the same time, without lobbying, actually, a policymaker can't draft a law. So it's not actually about eliminating lobbying, but give it a standard, give it ethical standards as well, to be able to draft a better regulation. Like in the school.
Well, this is a ring which tells us that in a few minutes we'll start a session of question and answer with our audience. But before that, we still have some 3 minutes. And I was afraid we wouldn't be able to identify any problems with capitalism during this discussion. Luckily, we found one, which was formulated, in fact, by Professor Pogge, which is, I would call it regulatory corruption, not in terms of straight paying to their pockets or under the table, but in terms of also mental corruption, people don't understand what they decide about, and they are listening to ill advice and so on. But I am coming back to actual illness or supposed illness of capitalism, which really brought us here and created this question how to fix capitalism, which is inequalities which are actually produced by capitalism. Is capitalism guilty of this huge inequality about which Professor Pogge was talking, or is it something else which is responsible? Politics.
I think basically the answer of not only Thomas Piketty but also many conservative commentators in the conservative international press is that we have to think in a new way about redistribution, and I think that is the question for politicians. So I don't think, as we heard here, the capitalism can't be blamed because there are many capitalisms. It's a more social one, more that one that addresses the inequalities in the society, but there's also a capitalism without regulation that actually leaves many behind. So I think we should think of how to engage politicians for this question of redistribution.
I would also add that investment in infrastructure, we talk about the very poor. Certainly there's a role to play for the local governments, but the very poor don't have access to capital. They don't have access to bank accounts. They don't have access to moving money. I mean, MoneyGram is in this business. We're in the financial services business, and so focused investment in basic infrastructure is going to be critical, because being poor is about a lot of things. But if we do start to be able to educate people and then need to invest in them, we've got to invest in the financial underpinning that will enable them to do that. And I do think that that's going to come in a lot of places. Corporate responsibility certainly plays a part of that. At MetLife, $200 million is being spent over the next 5 years on financial inclusion, focused on this lower income population, because it's so critical that we start to get underneath not just education and opening people's worldview, but also the infrastructure that goes with it.
Professor.
So capitalism is interestingly related to both equality and inequality. So capitalism, the idea is that we have a competition that elicits the best efforts of everybody. Everybody tries very, very hard to do something innovative, something creative, something that pleases consumers and so on. And that competition can work only if we all start at the same line. If some of us are already getting a 50-yard head start, then they don't have to try very hard to win the race. And so we don't get the best efforts. So capitalism depends, in order to function well, on equality of opportunity, on everybody getting a fair chance. But it's also fundamentally related to inequality because, of course, the winner is supposed to be rewarded. And so at the end, when the rewards are given out, the winners will have more than the losers, those who made the better product and so on. And then comes the problem. The problem is that the winners will try to lock in their gains. So, for example, if I'm among the winners, I will say, I want to give my children a head start for the next generation. I want to send my children to a more expensive private school so that they will be ahead of the other kids. And that undermines capitalism again. So the very principle of capitalism, that you reward the winners, also undermines capitalism, because the winners will then use their winnings to lock in their advantage. Another way they can lock in their advantage is they say, okay, I've won fair and square, I did a better product or whatever, now I will take some of my money to Washington and try to give it as campaign contributions in order to make sure that the legislature will favor me the next time round, so that I don't have to work so hard to win, but win in the easier way by buying myself some political support. So that's where I see a fundamental contradiction, if you like, in capitalism, that there's always the thing that the very good thing about capitalism, the rewarding of the winners, can undermine the level playing field that capitalism depends on to be the best that it can be?
I'm afraid
All right, that's fine.
we need to ask our audience to give us a few questions. I am sure that you will be able to sneak your answers to the previous discussions in the answers to the questions from the audience.
Szanowni Państwo, czas na pytania z sali. Bardzo proszę.
Now it's time for questions from the audience. The microphone is here in the middle.
Proszę o zadawanie pytań.
But please ask questions and not deliver speeches. Paweł Tyszkiewicz from SARI Marketing Association. What I missed in this discussion, in your debate, I missed one word which may combine the contradictory situations, meaningful lobbying, without which we will not be having good law, and on the other side, regulation, which is necessary for the economy, to have inclusive economy. So I miss self-regulation and co-regulation, these two terms. We have a whole spectrum of thinking about regulation, which is not only a state regulation and it's not only about winning our own strategic advantages by paying politicians to be locked in our victory. So what we are looking for, we'll be looking for a model how to include public in this regulation so that we will be having co-regulation. This is my question. How do you see this change of attitude to lobbying by co-regulation and self-regulation, and not just individual lobbying? So let's take all the questions and then we'll try to come up with answers.
I'm Salvatore Babonis of the University of Sydney. I come from the same world of data-driven development sociology as Professor Pogge. I can certify all of the statistics he cited as being absolutely true. But I have a question for the business people on the panel. One problem of capitalism that we have not discussed is monopolism. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and other internet companies engage in behaviors every day that would be illegal if your companies engaged in them. Buying companies only to close them down, offering services for free in order to drive people out of the market, all sorts of anti-competitive behaviors. Microsoft and Google have been fined billions of euros by the European Union, and yet they still engage in these anti-competitive behaviors. Where do you see competition policy or antitrust policy as a tool for improving capitalism?
Bardzo dziękuję. Bardzo proszę.
Adam Czerniak, Polityka Insights. From the discussion that you've been having, and a public discussion we've heard, we have this clear attitude that, well, capitalism might be the reason of growing discrepancies in income. No, I believe that the income discrepancies are in the very nature of our society. Do you know in which country there are biggest income discrepancies? In Northern Korea, which it means to me that capitalism is the only system which we know which may level up in discrepancies there. This is my question to you. What type of institutions, what model of capitalism may limit income discrepancies? Which kind of solutions should be looking for?
Hello. Konrad Miciukiewicz, University College London. I would like to ask all panelists about the millennial generation. Some of you mentioned that the new generation of employees is different, that they want to hope that the companies have values, that they create values for others around them, and not only that they have these values, but also that the corporate world caters for these values through corporate social programs, through creating value systems, and to building some positive societal environment. My question is, what do you think this generation of millennial people who will take over corporate management systems in 15 years' time, how can they change capitalism? To what extent do you have hopes that they will bring about real change? And what might be the nature of this change?
Thank you very much. Bardzo proszę.
Tomasz Wudziak from the Family Corporate Association. I would like to highlight one paradox. It seems to me that Poland is at a different stage of development than, well, if you compare it to globally. We have the 60 years long gap which we need to make up for. The gap was resulted by the totalitarian regimes we had in this country. And we have this issue, we have this problem. We have the very first generation of people who developed Polish companies. They get globalized now. And if we introduced solutions proposed by Thomas Piketty, well, I read the book by him, then Poland's economy, based on family business, would have no chance to grow, because we would need, in the second generation, we would need to equal opportunities. What would happen to us, to the family businesses? So will we need to sell our companies in order to be able to pay taxes, which would be used to level up opportunities, which would be meant to provide equal opportunities? Thank you for the questions. They were really broad. We don't have that much time, so now I would like to ask the panelists to refer to two issues only. One, a very interesting statement from the public that the inequalities are not because of capitalism, and capitalism may reduce inequalities. That's one issue, one statement. And the other one, which I would like to highlight, is this question about global monopolies, which are taken from any control, any regulation whatsoever.
Any comment from anybody?
I'll take the global equality here, but I think I agree. Inequality has existed for as long as man has been on this planet, and in the markets that we talk about, the developing, in the last 25 years, we've eradicated or lifted half of the population in extreme poverty out of it. We are doing amazing things in a relatively short period of time in all of mankind when you think about how things are moving. And a lot of that is through globalization and through the capitalism spreading. I think the bigger issue that we're starting to see is the inequality that's happening in the developed nations and the widening of the gap, and back to the middle class and this where does the middle class go? And I don't necessarily know if it's capitalism. I think it's much more of the broader macro, moving from an agrarian into an industrial economy and moving now into a digital economy, and we have a severe skills gap with many of our employees, and I think there's a need to be able to lift these people up. Why do we have skills and talent shortages, and why are we fighting for people? Because there's just not enough people to do the work that we want. There's a lot of other people, but they don't have the skills to do the work that we want. And so you have globalization, you have labor arbitrage going across the world, where incredibly your workforce is becoming more global, right? MoneyGram in the last year moved 25% of our workforce to Warsaw because we were looking for skilled talent. And why did we do that? Because we thought that this would be a great place to build a global business. You have highly educated people, great work ethic, language skills. It was perfect for us, and it's proven to be a great investment for us. And so you see that happening across the globe, but we're looking for that skills gap, and we have to find solutions to that in corporate and development training and private-public working to be able to lift the skills and narrow that gap. And I think you'll see the inequality in the developed nations shrink.
I'd just like to add to that, with the globalization and with the global multinational companies, what we're seeing in many markets around the world is that as they come into new markets, so MoneyGram and Warsaw, MetLife as well, across our 50 markets, that all boats rise. So as multinational corporations come into marketplaces, local corporations are actually also rising. And specifically in the business that I have responsibility for, which is employee benefits, oftentimes multinational corporations are coming out of westernized economies, Western Europe, US, where offering financial products, health products, and other things are really part of the value proposition to employees. So what we see is as global multinationals come into markets where you do have a lower middle income, lower income population, that even local companies then start to think about the value proposition to their employees. So all boats actually rise when we see globalization, if there is the right kind of even playing field, which is part of the regulatory framework of each company.
Yeah, please.
You picked on monopolism as a main issue, and I think that it's also very much related to the not only economics and capitalism, but it very much relates again to politics and media. I would like to give you an example. For example, in the Czech Republic, basically all mainstream media are being owned by oligarchs. There are, beside of the public media, there is actually no free media, I would say. So you see also that the public space is somehow captured in economic terms as well. And you see that as far as the capital actually moves around the globe, we see that a much bigger need for international regulation. And again, I don't think the nation states, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, etc., in Visegrad countries can actually face that alone. I think that's another argument for transparency on a European level, and I think it's in the interest of Poland and any other member country in the European Union to actually fight for more transparency in negotiations that the European Union actually leads internationally to regulate the global market also in terms of fighting monopolies. But let me also very briefly react on one of the questions. I think it was the second one relating to the self-regulation. I think that is something that I've tried to mention in my first contribution, that actually the self-empowerment and self-organization outside of the typical political scheme on the level of businesses, name it corporations or small and medium enterprises, is something very important that hasn't been actually used enough yet to actually set new frameworks and set new standards. I mean, for example, what Ashoka does is that we work with companies and entrepreneurs that are very much aware of a broader notion of their undertakings, that it's not only a profit-oriented issue, but it's also that you actually make your profit within a society and you actually give something in return, and you can actually invest. Once you design the services you want to sell, you can design them in a more intelligent way. You can design them that they serve the society at the same time as they give you back the profit. And I think this self-organization within the entrepreneurial world is something that actually should take place in a much more force than is actually taking place now. Yeah.
Professor, will you comment?
Yeah, so quickly on these two problems of inequality and monopoly. So with regard to the inequality, I think, again, the important thing here is that we keep opportunities widely distributed. Capitalism's well-functioning depends on that people can compete on a level playing field, and this does indeed require public goods, such as education in particular, that good educational opportunities are available to everybody, and financing that out of progressive taxation and also inheritance taxes. I want to emphasize, I mean, one of the speakers here said that this is difficult for family enterprises to pay a big inheritance tax which may destroy the business. I think that's exactly right, and that should be prevented, and you can prevent that by deferring the taxes when the family business stays within the family, because what really creates the inequality is that somebody draws large amounts of money out and then spends that money. So long as the money stays within the business, I think the taxes can be deferred, and so the family business can be preserved. Now, with regard to monopoly, that's a paradigm case of what I was talking about, how the winners in the competition try to lock in their winnings. It's a wonderful story, what happened with intellectual property rights, for example, which is behind many of these monopolies. What happened was that in the middle 1990s, the World Trade Organization was formed, and in these negotiations, it was really supposed to be about trade, but the very IP-heavy, intellectual property-heavy industries in the United States saw an opportunity to get something in return. They said, look, if the Americans are opening their markets for all these other countries to import into the US, then why don't we get something in exchange from them? Why don't we force them to make a concession to us? And the concession shall be that they will agree to implement very strong intellectual property rights that protect our technological advantage. Now, which four industries were these? You can guess. It was the software industry, the entertainment industry, the agribusinesses, and the pharma industry. Those had very heavy intellectual property rights that were already very well protected in the United States and in Europe and in Japan. And they wanted it to be protected everywhere in the world. They wanted rich people in India and Brazil also to pay lots of money for using medicines. But of course, the predictable result was that the vast majority of human beings are now excluded from, for example, advanced medicines. They can no longer afford to buy any kind of new medicine because it's under patent and it sells for some ridiculous price. Maybe you read recently a hepatitis C drug came out and they're charging $1,000 for each pill. So you have to take it for a period of 12 weeks, 84 days, so you pay $84,000 to be cured of your hepatitis C. That's just one example. So these intellectual property rights and the evergreening that goes with it is a wonderful example of this monopolization, locking in advantages, and it's the modern equivalent of feudalism, right? The feudal landlords, they said, the land belongs to us, you can work here if you like, but you have to give us half of the product of your work. And that's what the big companies are now saying, except they don't want half, they want much more than half. Namely, they take something like 99% of the sales price and leave just 1% for the actual manufacturing.
Okay.
This is a warning that we have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to take this 2 minutes because we need to wrap up this discussion. We wanted to save the world. We wanted to offer some meaningful solutions for capitalism to make it healthy. First, we managed to identify a number of diseases that afflict capitalism. We said that there is no way that we can regulate relations in capitalism in a reasonable way. To put it short, regulators are corrupt. Another problem is that the most important businesses that decide about our life, so people who control what we have in our smartphones, that really disrupts normal market competition. As a result, the newcomers have no chance to score a success unless they offer a truly disruptive technology. And despite Professor Pogge's efforts, we didn't really cover much the fundamental topic that was the inspiration to this panel, namely inequalities that are generated by capitalism. One of our members of the audience claimed that inequalities are an inherent feature of capitalism or of the market and of the whole process of generating value on the market. And capitalists should not be blamed for that. This is just life. So, in my opinion, these are the three main points that we highlighted here as malaise of capitalism. And unfortunately, or fortunately, if you will, we were not able to offer any solutions. Capitalism is like a democracy. It's an awful system, but never has come up with a better idea. Well, thank you for your attention, and hopefully we were able to give you some food for thought. Let's applaud our panelists. Thank you for your contributions, and I would like to thank our moderator, Mr. Broniatowski, for moderating this panel. And I would like to ask all the panelists to stay in place. Probably everyone knows what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the evaluation. There is an ongoing effort throughout this forum. We want to draw some conclusions for the future. We want to improve ourselves from year to year. Therefore, we strongly encourage you to make assessment when you exit this room. You just have to touch the screen, and that's all it takes to assess this plenary session. This plenary session was about capitalism and how we should fix it. I also encourage you to take part in parallel panel sessions that will begin after lunch at 3:30, and the second round starts at 5:30. At 8 p.m., right here, we are going to have a closing gala. Grażyna Torbicka will be our Master of Ceremony, and during the gala event, we will share with you the Sopot Declaration that will summarize the recommendations that were voiced during the panels and plenary sessions, recommendations for Polish and European decision makers. Again, let's applaud our panelists to appreciate their contribution. Thank you.
I oczywiście family photo. Zapraszam Państwa do family photo.